Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Jen's Books. I hope you're having an amazing week. This is another Six from the Shelf video. So in this video, I'm actually going to be talking about six 19th century novels that are seen as classics of their time. I mentioned in my last video that this time of year, I often feel myself, really drawn to reading a classic novel. And there are some that I read over and over again, and some which I don't. And I thought what I would do is I'd talk about six books which I really, really enjoy, and also mention some that I wouldn't touch, again with a barge pole. And as I say with any of my videos, please do bear in mind these are just my opinions and I may be wrong. So if you completely disagree with me, that is absolutely fine. But I'd love to know what your thoughts are, what your favourite classic 19th century Victorian novels are. Are you a massive Dickens fan? Are you balmy about the Brontes? Let me know in the comments. I'd really like to know, what your recommendations are. So first of all, I wanted to avoid talking about any novels which I've spoken about before, ones that are probably would be a bit too cliche for me. Those of you who follow my channel will know I have a real sort of obsession with Gothic fiction. So I'm not going to be talking about Dracula, but do read it. I'm not going to be talking about Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, but do read it. I'm not going to be talking about Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, but do read it. All of those are fabulous books and I really recommend them. But I thought it would be good to talk about something a little bit less, well, I don't know, some of these are a bit Gothic actually. And the other one that I'm always drawn to talk about, but I have spoken about quite a few times now, is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, which is my absolute favourite Bronte book, and it is one that I do pick up and revisit periodically. So the first book I wanted to sort of recommend is the fabulous, fabulous, fabulous Vanity Fair. And Vanity Fair is by William Makepeace Thackeray, and it was originally published as a serial over 1847 and 1848 in a magazine. That happened a lot with novels in the 19th century, the serialised, particularly Dickens as well, actually. I really, really love this. It's a sort of a satire on Victorian society. And one of the things that really struck me was how modern it felt. It doesn't feel really laboured and sort of ancient. It feels quite fresh and feels quite just really easy to get on with. There's a third person narration, but the narrator we find as it goes on is sort of unreliable in himself. But for me, the thing I really, really love about this book is Becky Sharp, who is our non-heroine. She is just fabulous. She is strong-willed and cunning. She's penniless, but she's absolutely committed to finding her way through life. And she can be quite cutthroat in some of her decisions, but we can't help but cheer her on regardless of that. I really, really enjoyed that. And there's a sense of comedy as well in some of the situations that she finds herself in, but not just comedy. You know, there are some sort of meaty, effective, emotional aspects to this novel, which I really enjoyed. So she begins the book as a student in a school. She ends up getting herself an invite to her friend's house, Emily Sudley. Emily Sudley is sort of a nice girl, and she gets herself into the family and she sets her sights on Emily's brother, but when that falls through, she moves on to the Crawleys and has a go there to find an appropriate husband. But she's determined to make her way, and that's what I really, really love about this novel, the fact that she just feels such a trailblazing character for the time period. Really, you can't help but admire her. It must have been quite shocking in some respects, her behaviour. I really, really enjoyed the adaptation of this as well with Reese Witherspoon. I really recommend that if you wanted to watch the film instead. But it's quite a chunky book, but I didn't find it laborious to read. I really, really enjoyed this one, and that's my first recommendation. The second recommendation, I'm cheating actually slightly. It's two books that I'm going to talk together about, and those are The Moonstone and The Lady in White by Wilkie Collins. So The Moonstone was written in 1868. The Woman in White, sorry, not The Lady, was written in 1859. So they're both written within the same decade of one another, and these are really kind of trailblazers in terms of detective fiction. would say that, you know, his writing is incredibly influential on what came afterwards and is still being influential in detective fiction. And I said that I was going to avoid the Gothic, but there's definitely Gothic aspects to these, particularly in The Woman in White, where it's sort of a bit more overt. But The Woman in White, we have a character called Walter Hartwright, who's an art teacher, and he has this really strange encounter in London with this lost woman who's dressed in white, and she asks for directions, and he sends her off. And not long afterwards, he gets a job tutoring young ladies in art, and finds that one of the ladies at Limmeridge House in Cumberland, where he's sent, has a very striking resemblance to this woman that he bumped into in London. And so there's a sort of this idea of this spectral woman in white. There's doubling, there's mistaken identities, there's switched identities, there's loads going on there, lots of twists and turns. Really, really enjoyed The Woman in White. The other one, The Moonstone, is about a character called Rachel Verinder, who inherits this huge cursed diamond from India, and she wears it on her birthday, but then it is stolen. And so it's a bit of a locked room mystery. Who has stolen this diamond? And the ownership of this diamond and sort of the reverberations of her having this book seem to end up with, you know, quite a lot of bad luck and you know, and sadness for the family. So it's quite interesting. Again, sort of this detective fiction full of twists and red herrings, and I really, really recommend Wilkie Collins if you've not read his work before. Again, they're quite chunky books, but they don't feel laborious to read, and as I say, probably quite trailblazing for the time as well, in terms of that influence that, on later detective fiction. Next, I don't feel that my list would be complete without a Jane Austen. And I'm not going to talk about Pride or Prejudice or Emma, which tend to be perhaps the most popular choices of Jane Austen, but Sense and Sensibility, which was published in 1811. I think one of the reasons I really love this book is because of the adaptation with Emma Thomas and Kate Winslet that came out in the early 90s, which I really, really loved. And one of the things I really enjoyed about reading Sense and Sensibility is it felt so familiar because I'd watched that adaptation so many times, and it felt so true to the adaptation. So I really, really enjoyed it. It feels comforting. It feels like a warm hug. You know that there's a happy ending in sight. But if you've not read Jane Austen before, I mean, all of her novels are great. I've just been reading Northanger Abbey, which I'll talk about in my next video. But I would recommend Sense and Sensibility. It's about two sisters. They have another sister and a brother as well, but it centres around Marianne and Eleanor Dashwood. They live with their widowed mother. When their father dies, they're forced to move to a friends of a family estate in Norland Park. Sort of he's a benevolent relative who takes them in, and during their time living in Norwood Park, they come into contact with various suitors, including Edward Ferrars and John Willoughby and Colonel Brandon. And I don't want to give too much away, but it's again, it's about making unwise decisions and kindnesses that kind of lead to unhappiness. You know, there are twists here and obstructions in the path of true love. But I find it again quite an easy book to read, considering it was published just into the 19th century, and quite funny, and an interesting reflection on the pressures on women of that time, and the pressures of class as well, and moving between classes. So that is my recommendation for Jane Austen. Feel free to disagree with me in the comments. As I say, I know there are probably Jane Austen books that you know are possibly more popular with some people. The next choice I kind of wanted to make for the same reasons. It's one that I've watched a lot of adaptations for. Gives me the warm fuzzies, and I think it's quite a lot of people have seen the adaptations but might not necessarily read the book, and that is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. And that was published in 2 volumes over 1868 and 1869. And this is about the four March sisters. You're probably no stranger to the story: Meg, Jo, Beth and Amy. And again, sort of how their lives are impacted by their love lives, the men they fall in love with, Laurie, who's the boy next door, and how he comes into their lives. Their father is fighting in the American Civil War, so he's away, and they're living in a time of quite a lot of hardship for a lot of people. It's an incredibly emotional book. There are ups and downs. There are times where you want to shout at particularly that Jo and say, you're making a mistake, but it all works out in the end. And actually, there are more volumes than the section that's usually focused on in the adaptations. But again, particularly this time of year, it's a really sort of cozy, nice read to settle down to, enjoyable to read, not difficult to read, really accessible. And yeah, definitely recommend it. I think it was aimed at younger people as well at the time when it was first published. But yeah, that's my fourth recommendation. I'm losing track already. It's because I'm cheating with that Wilkie Collins and giving you two. So the next one, again, it kind of feel like you know, it would be unfair not to include some Dickens. So I was thinking Great Expectations, which was published in 1861. That's probably my favourite and probably the most famous full-length novel of his. But I decided against it. I decided I wanted to recommend A Christmas Carol, which was published in 1843, which is a novella. It's quite short. You can sit down and read it quickly. You can also get some really good audio versions. Dickens, he travelled the country reciting this book to audiences. It was kind of created with the voice in mind, and that really comes across. But what really amazes me with this particular novella is just how perfect it is. You know, the turn of phrase, the imagery, it's so Dickensian, but it's also just feels just right. I love the description, particularly in the opening of the novel. It's just great, and as I say, it continues to have a massive impact on how we celebrate Christmas, if you celebrate Christmas. So if you're wanting for something a bit warm and cozy, maybe a little bit later in the year, then definitely revisit A Christmas Carol. It's just a short read, really, but for me, it's Dickens at his finest. It's just fabulous, and one that I probably revisit most Christmases, where in some form or another. Last of all, need to include a Bronte. As I said, I wasn't going to mention Jane Eyre. So because I'm not mentioning Jane Eyre, I thought, what is my other favourite Bronte novel? So I decided to talk about The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, and it's Anne Bronte's second and final novel, which was published in 1848. And the reason this always stuck in my mind, I haven't read it for a lot of years, but the fact that, again, it would have been quite shocking at the time that it was written. We have this character who has run away from a husband, and that would have been quite a lot for a lot of the audience at the time the book was written. It's also told in a series of letters, which is quite nice as well. So it has that really interesting form that it comes through by a guy called Gilbert, who actually, so actually we don't actually get the tenant of the tenant of Wildfell Hall's actual point of view. It's told through these observations through another character, but I just found it so refreshing after reading some of the other Victorian fiction that I'd had at the time. And yeah, so if you've read Bronte, you've probably read some already, but if you've not read Tenant of Wildfell Hall, I do recommend that one. And it's interesting to think that it was actually banned at one point as well, so it was clearly seen as quite shocking and certainly an early feminist novel. So those are sort of the recommendations I wanted to make, and then I wanted to talk a bit about some of the books I'd read but I'm not going to return to. So first of all, I love Charlotte Bronte. I really, really love her writing, particularly Jane Eyre. It's fabulous. But saying for how much I love Jane Eyre, I wouldn't revisit either Villette or The Professor. The Professor was Charlotte Bronte's first novel, and in those days it was very common for people to speak a lot more French than we do now, and I found that quite difficult when I was reading The Professor. And Villette is kind of almost a rewriting of The Professor in some ways. It seems very similar to me. It's a book that I was supposed to read for my degree and never did. I actually did an exam on it without having read the book. So it's one that I felt that I should read. So in more recent years, I've picked up and read it. But for me, it feels like a bit more of a struggle. And if I had to make a recommendation, it'd be Jane Eyre. I probably wouldn't pick either of those up again. Another one which I know a lot of people really, really love, and funnily enough, it's another one that I should have read when I was studying and didn't, so I felt like I should read it more recently, and that's The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. I just found it a bit of a slog. Quite a few of the books I've mentioned already in this video are quite chunky books, and this one is as well. But for me, it just didn't do it. And I'm sure for a lot of people, they'd really, really enjoy it. But for me, no, it's not one I'm going to pick up again. Not even the payoff at the end made it worth it for me. But I'm sure that lots of people really love it. And I'd love to know, if you really enjoyed it, what you really enjoyed about the book. In terms of Dickens, one that I probably wouldn't revisit is Hard Times. I think it's a really interesting reflection on the time period and the impact of the Industrial Revolution on the people around them. But I found it a bit of a slog, particularly because, for example, there's one character that has a very strong, Stephen Blackpool has a very strong dialect in the writing, and I found that quite hard to read. And also because, again, it was another story that was told in episodes, I really feel like the first half is really strong, and I don't feel, for me, it continues in the same way. But then saying that, even talking about it makes me think, should I read it again? What do you think? Shall I give Hard Times another go, or is it just going to give me another hard time? War and Peace is one that I haven't read by Tolstoy, but it is one that I love the story of. I've watched adaptations, but is it worth reading? I'd really love to know, because it's so big. I think it would take me months and months and months. And one of the things I've heard about it is there are lots of lists of names and relations and things, and I'm wondering whether I'll be able to keep up with it. What do you think? Is War and Peace worth picking up? Conrad, Heart of Darkness is another one that I didn't love when I read it, but it is quite a short novel, so maybe again I should give it another go. See, I'm already on the fence with a lot of these books already as to whether or not I should pick them up again. Wuthering Heights is one that I didn't enjoy when I read it when I was studying, but it's on my list to reread. I feel like I really would get a lot more out of it now than I did when I first read it. I think when I first read it, I assumed, thanks to Kate Bush, that there was going to be some sort of passionate love affair, and I didn't really feel that in the reading when I read it. So it is one that all these people who love Wuthering Heights can't be wrong. I feel like I need to give it another go. I also want to read The Count of Monte Cristo by Dumas. I have a copy of that, and in fact my phone is propped up on it as I'm videoing this, and it's massive. So I feel like maybe I need to spend some time just reading some of these really long classic novels. I'd also like to read Anna Karenina, Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. One I'd really love to read, particularly this time of the year, and maybe it's one I'll read in the next couple of months, is The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, because, spoiler alert, you know, again, it's that gothic book. I have read or seen adaptations of it, but I'd really like to actually read the source material. So that's one that's on my list. Also, Madame Bovary by Flaubert. I'm also really enjoy Thomas Hardy books. I've read quite a few of his books. It's difficult to pick one that I enjoy the most, but probably Far from the Madding Crowd. I really enjoyed that. Has anybody read any Hardy? Which is your favourite Hardy book? D.H. Lawrence I've also read quite a lot of, and Elizabeth Gaskell. So, I mean, I don't feel bad for not having read all of the classics. I think in our lifetime there's more books than you're ever going to be able to read. If you read from the moment you were born till the moment you passed away, you'd never read a touch on the amount of books, particularly in my case anyway. that I'd want to read. So I don't feel bad for not having read all of this sort of classic Victorian literature, but I do want to be selective about what I pick. So it'd be really nice to know whether you have any suggestions, or maybe you just don't really find, you know, books from that period of interest at all, which is also absolutely fine. But I shall see you in the comments. I'd love to know your thoughts on this, and I'll speak to you again soon. Take care. Bye.